Right, let's go ahead and get started this morning. Thanks everyone for joining us today. This is our third webinar under the topic umbrella of Focus. So do appreciate you finding shelter in the storm with us. My name's Dan. I'm on the marketing team with Hasselblad, coming to you from the New York area. But whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, we are thankful to have you here. Now, as is tradition, we do have a little bit of housekeeping just in case this is your first webinar with Hasselblad or first time using the GoToWebinar session. Before we do get started, we want to make sure that you're joining us via the best platform possible, either desktop or tablet, since the components in play today are designed for that. If at any time you do get disconnected, just refer back to the link that you received in the registration email and the confirmation there. Now, if we've made it this far and you can't hear us yet, do check the audio settings in the audio output settings in the control panel. And by default, that's on the right-hand side if you're on desktop, or if you're joining via mobile device like a tablet, just check that silent mode is turned off and the speakers are turned up. Now, don't worry, your microphone's mute is enabled, but we do want to hear from you. In the control panel on desktop is the question box where you can feel free to ask us questions along the way. And likewise, if you're on the mobile app, it's just the question mark icon in the top right corner. I have my lovely colleagues, Chris and Emmy, working in the background this morning to help answer those, and we'll actually address a couple of those right at the end too. So as we move along, if you have any questions, do feel free to ask us along the way. But if you don't get an answer immediately, don't worry, it might actually be addressed later on in the session. And if we don't get a chance to get to it, as there's a fair number of people joining us today, we'll follow up with you afterwards too. So to give you a quick overview of what we've got in store today, we'll start with a few background resources that you might find handy if you're not immediately familiar with our software family. Moving on to our main topic, moving on to our main topic in terms of the overview of cameras that work with Phocus Mobile 2 along with the recommended hardware. And from that, we'll go over a connected overview, either a wired or wireless setup, starting with wireless and then moving on to a guided demonstration that shows you with a wired setup everything you need to know from import to export in terms of working with Phocus Mobile 2. Now at the very end, we'll jump to some of your questions and answers, so definitely do continue filling those out in the question pane as we move along. So as mentioned, two resources that I'd really recommend watching afterwards. Firstly is our Exploring Focus webinar from last week, which is an overview of our software and app product family, along with our Focus 3.5 overview hosted by my colleague Chris, which is a great in-depth look at our desktop software as well. So links to these are both in the Learning More PDF that's in the handout section of today's webinar that's on the top right corner of the mobile app, or in the control panel if you're on desktop. Or you can also watch these on our YouTube channel simply by searching Hasselblad webinar. We have these along with a couple of other great exciting online sessions already online for you to enjoy at your leisure. So before we get too far in, we do want to make some clarification since there's some confusion given how our mobile apps are named. And we actually have two apps. The first is Phocus Mobile, which is our first generation app that's been designed for iPad or iPhone. And it's meant to connect to a desktop session of Focus or directly to an H5D 50C Wi-Fi or H6D or first generation X1D. Now, if you want a fuller look at this particular app, do check out that Exploring Focus webinar. But today's topic really concentrates on Phocus Mobile 2, which is our current generation app that's currently built for iPad. And before we jump to kind of the device side of things, let's take a look at the supported cameras. And that namely comes down to the X1D 250C and 907X Special Edition. Now, thankfully, both of these cameras use the USB Type-C connector for both data and charging, and it really makes interfacing with an iPad or Phocus Mobile 2 significantly easier. And admittedly, one of the questions we get quite often is why Phocus Mobile 2 doesn't connect with other cameras. And ultimately, it comes down to the hardware improvements that we've made in these more recent product releases. And namely, that's MFI certification. MFI is a safety and security protocol put in place by Apple for any devices that connect physically to an iPhone, iPad, or iPad product. And because the development of our first generation X1D or the H6D cameras predate our development of Phocus Mobile 2, this level of connectivity is impossible. And similarly so, the X1D 250C and the 907X Special Edition connect primarily to Phocus Mobile 2 or Focus on desktop. They don't support that first generation app. Moving on to recommendations for host devices, Phocus Mobile 2 has a minimum spec requirement of an iPad running iOS 12 or later, along with 3 gigabytes of RAM. Now, specifically down to the models, our first recommendation in this regard is the third generation iPad Pro released in 2018, or the fourth generation that was released earlier this year in March. And we recommend these specifically given their USB Type-C interface, which really makes connectivity significantly easier. Now, you can still connect with an iPad Air 2018 or later, or the second generation iPad Pro. Both of these use a Lightning-based connector for data and charging rather than USB Type-C, which can complicate the wired connection setup, but we'll go over that in a second. Now, thankfully, regardless of platform, Phocus Mobile 2 and its supported cameras can communicate wirelessly, which we'll actually walk you through now. Now, I'll be showing you on an X1D2 and the iPad Pro, but the steps are nearly the same for an iPad Air or the 907X Special Edition. Firstly, we're going to make sure that the iPad's Wi-Fi and Bluetooth are turned on. And while the camera uses Wi-Fi for its primary data communication, we do use a Bluetooth assistant to make the connection process much easier. Now, over onto the camera, you'll want to swipe up to the menu screen or just press the hamburger button on the button stack on the bottom right. Now, once we're at that menu screen, we're going to the connectivity menu. And by factory default, that is on the shortcut grid. However, if you've remapped your shortcuts to something else, you can, of course, tap the gear icon and scroll to connectivity. And once we're in that menu screen, let's actually take a quick look at some of the options and parameters here. This first one at the top actually pertains to a wireless connection mode, Mac or PC correlating to a desktop setup for tethered shooting. And in this case, since we'll be jumping to an iPad setup later, we'll actually switch it over to iOS. Moving on down, next is the Wi-Fi connectivity switch. And one neat feature is that if you're toggling this on and off quite regularly, you can actually change this over to one of the camera's 3 customizable shortcut buttons. So makes it very quick and easy to access. And likewise, in this case, we'll turn it on. Now, I generally keep Wi-Fi off to conserve battery life, but for the sake of this demonstration, we'll need it turned on. Down below that are the 2 Wi-Fi options that the X1D2 supports. And by default, it supports a 5 gigahertz connection mode, which is prioritizing speed over all else, but it doesn't do as well over longer distances or through walls. You can change it over to a 2.4 gigahertz option, which does pass through walls better, does travel over distances better, but albeit with a slower transfer speed. Down below that is the SSID, or the camera's Wi-Fi network name. This is unique to every individual camera. And below that is the password. And by default, that password is quite simple. You can change it just by tapping the change password button right below it. But it's up to you along the way. It'll just generate a random string of numbers and letters to update the password there. At the very bottom of the menu is the reset paired devices setting. And because we're going through the setup for the first time, we'll actually reset it. And likewise, if you ever have any issues with a stable connection, it doesn't hurt to start from fresh by tapping this reset option as well. So bringing our iPad back in and opening Phocus Mobile 2, up top by default, we have album selected, which shows images that have been already imported. And I'll just tap on over to camera. And you can see that the app is actually already searching for a device using that Bluetooth assistant. So you do want to have the camera relatively close by the iPad itself so that it can pick up on the Bluetooth and start the process. So once it detects a camera nearby, it'll pop up here, and the name is abbreviated, but it does correlate with the name in the connectivity menu. And tapping connect, since it's the first time, we'll have to go through a couple of extra steps just to confirm that that the right devices are talking to each other. So the app has launched a dialog box asking me to confirm on the camera, and the camera will also launch its dialog box asking if I do want to confirm this Wi-Fi connection request with the device name of the iPad showing up on the rear camera screen. So just tapping the allow button, the iPad now switches back over and wants me to confirm that I want to switch my iPad's Wi-Fi connection over to the one being generated by the camera. And this is really just the last step confirmation to make sure, are you really sure this is the Wi-Fi network you want to join? And we'll click join on the iPad. Now, if for some reason the Bluetooth assistant fails, it's also quite easy to connect manually to the camera's Wi-Fi. all you need to do is go into the device or the iPad's Wi-Fi settings, just like if you were traveling somewhere and wanted to connect to the Wi-Fi network at the hotel or a cafe, and navigate to the Wi-Fi network that correlates with the name in the connectivity menu, and then when prompted, enter the password there below. Once the Wi-Fi is connected and confirmed in the iPad, you can swipe back over to the app, and you'll actually have two areas of confirmation to show that the camera is connected. Firstly, the camera icon in the top left corner of the app is no longer grayed out, and also on the camera itself, the shot counter, where normally you have a digit counter showing the remaining number of shots available on the SD card, has been replaced with the Wi-Fi symbol. So quickly looking at the pros and cons of a wired connection, or excuse me, a wireless connection. As you can see, it's a very simple process to getting connected. And of course, you have the option of either a 2.4 gigahertz option or 5 gigahertz option that lets you prefer speed or distance in that wireless connection. Now, somewhere kind of in the middle of these choices is that it is a wireless connection. So there are no cables to trip over, but it also means that you're at risk of any kind of interference. So if you have multiple wireless routers, microwaves, cordless phones, strangely enough, even some dedicated flash triggers can make wireless connectivity a little bit unstable. And in that same stroke, the fastest Wi-Fi connection is still about 1/5 of what a cabled or a wired connection can achieve. And in that line, because the camera is now generating its own ad hoc Wi-Fi network, it will drain the battery a bit faster. So let's take a look at what we need for a wired connection and the tools in place to get up and running on that front. We're going to split the host devices into two categories. Firstly, Lightning-based devices, which is the iPad Air or iPad Pro 2017, and USB Type-C based devices like the third generation iPad Pro or the current spec fourth gen released in March. Now, starting with Lightning, the simplest option would be a Lightning to Type-C cable. And this is the Lightning connector that plugs into the iPad on one side and the USB connector that plugs into the camera on the other side. Simple is a relative term because things can get a bit tricky. We do recommend a USB or a cable that's rated for USB 3 or 3.1 data transfer speeds. And there's a fair amount of these cables out in the market that are better suited towards charging. And so when you're looking at cables, you do want to look for a reputable manufacturer or vendor. And even in our own testing of a pretty wide array of Lightning to Type-C cables, we get a mixed bag of results. Sometimes it works beautifully. Sometimes it reverts to a USB 2 transfer speed. Sometimes you're sitting there and it doesn't connect at all. So the good news is that we have an alternative that we found to be a bit more consistent, and that's by way of the Lightning to Type A camera adapter. And it's simply one end plugs into the iPad, the other is a USB port that you can plug the camera into. And for this, you'll just need a USB-C to A cable, like the one that's included in the box with the X1D2 or 907X Special Edition. Additionally, it adds a Lightning port for pass-through charging for the iPad as well, which is pretty convenient. And we found this to be a fair bit more consistent in terms of just getting connected, but likewise, sometimes we see reduced transfer speeds as well. And the addition of an adapter in that line of communication, of course, adds a point of failure or risk area there. So for those reasons, we really do recommend the iPad Pro 2018 and 2020 because they have that direct Type-C to Type-C interface. And simply put, it's just a single cable. Again, just like the first cable, we recommend looking for one that is rated at 3 or 3.1 transfer speeds. And a great example is that you can buy a charging cable that slows down the data rate. For like if you own a late model MacBook, for example, it comes with a really nice cable for the charger. It's long, it's very durable, but it is primarily meant for charging rather than data transfer. So even if you connect that cable from an iPad to your X1D2, you'll see a USB 2 transfer speed, and sometimes it even flakes out. So moral of the story is do keep an eye on what you're purchasing and where you're finding your cables and what you choose in that regard. So looking at the pros and cons in comparison, obviously we recommend the wired connection for a faster transfer speed, about 5 times faster than the best optimal wireless situation. And likewise, it's not as easily affected by its environment. So if you have a crowded Wi-Fi environment or a bunch of devices nearby, the wired connection is significantly more stable, and it doesn't have as big of an impact on battery. Given that the camera has its Wi-Fi off, the battery life is much more in line with what you would expect for a non-connected or non-tethered setup. But You do want to keep in mind that typically cables you'll see for a Type-C to Type-C connection max out at around 15 feet or 4.5 meters. If you're using one of the adapted cables, so the Lightning to Type-C, these typically will be a 1 or 2 meter option at best. And typically for most cables after a certain distance, you start experiencing line loss or data connection starts to get inconsistent. And likewise, it is a physical interface. So it is a cable that can be tripped over. So do want to be mindful of the setup when you have cables around you. So we'll actually pause this for now, and I would like to get to know you better. So what we'll do is open up a poll for the audience here, and just want to see how many of our attendees today have worked with a Hasselblad camera or currently own a Hasselblad camera. So that should be on your screen right now. Surprisingly, it looks like a little bit over half of our attendees today are using an X1D2, so really do appreciate you joining us and learning more about that setup. So out of curiosity, since a fair bit of you are using the X1D2, we'll throw another poll out there for how many of you are already using Phocus Mobile 2. So it looks like a lot of people have not tried it yet. So really glad to have you here and that we can kind of get this, get you updated and educated in that regard. So we'll go ahead and close that poll for now and start the screen share there. So flipping our webcam here, you can actually see we have a bit of a live setup in front of us. In front of me, I have my iPad Pro. I'm working with a 12-inch model or 12.9-inch model, and then X1D2 and a 45mm and a lovely subject in front of me. And so to talk a little bit about the wired connection process, things are quite simple. All I need to do is connect a USB Type-C cable that's on both ends. In this case, I'm using one that was relatively well reviewed for data transfer speeds online and quite nice. It's just a simple braided cable. And so on one end, I have my Type-C connector and then running straight into the iPad. And so because it's well, in this case, the 2018 model, the connection process is quite simple. All I need to do is connect one end to the camera, connect the other end over to my iPad here. And with the wired setup, what's neat is that the shot counter on the rear of the camera might be a little bit small for you to see, but typically where it would show me the remaining number of shots in the camera has now been moved over to the USB 3 symbol. If for some reason the cable was not working as well or I didn't have as good of a connection, it would actually show USB 2. And if it wasn't connected at all, then it would just show me the remaining shots in the available on the SD card. So in this case, I'll recompose. And let's take a walkthrough on the app. So in this case, I'll actually pause that webcam so you can see the app a bit better. And starting on the top of the app in the top left corner, I typically recommend starting with the configuration settings. This is where you'll find two pretty important features. As we go through the app, there's a little gray circle that helps you identify where I'm pointing to. Just follow that along. So firstly, with the camera, you can see here that I have the option to do firmware updates through the app. In this case, I'll just need to enable that there. And you can see that my X1D2 is up to date with version 1.10, but lo and behold, my XCD45 could use an update. And if I were to click 540 on the update, what it would do is download from our server and then install the firmware update through the app. Now, I won't do that live because, well, it's all very delicate setup. But in this case, as far as the webcast goes, but it just takes a matter of minutes for a lens firmware update, and it's incredibly easy to stay up to date with the latest firmware. So really glad to have it there. Now you can still download the firmware updates manually. So in that sense, you can still go to the Hasselblad website in the My Hasselblad section of the site, download a CIM file to an SD card, and then install that manually through the camera as well. So two available options, this one being quite simple. Below that, you'll have the capture options, and this is where you would choose where to save the files. So on this device refers to the files that are being shot in the camera and being ported directly to the iPad's internal storage. So it's basically a full tethered host, where on the camera does refer to that the images are going to be stored on the SD card. And this is really kind of the differentiation between using this as a viewer versus a full tethered host. So in the sense that if I were to choose on this camera, it would be acting as a viewer. So I'm seeing the images appear on the iPad. However, I am not saving them directly to the internal storage. In this case, we'll select on this device, and that way the full 50 megapixel RAW files are going to be saved directly to the iPad's internal storage. So we'll collapse that menu there. Moving over, I have my camera control window, and you can see here that the design language and the user interface is very much familiar to anyone who's used the X1D, and it uses the same kind of tap and scroll architecture. So in this case, you can easily adjust the exposure remotely. I'm in manual mode as indicated by the little M down there. And of course, I can change my metering mode from center to spot to center spot. If I were in an automated mode, so let me switch over to aperture priority, I can of course dial in my exposure compensation. Switching back to manual, I have aperture and shutter speed. Sorry about that, let's collapse that. And then ISO and the ability to toggle focus modes, autofocus or manual focus. Up here at the top, I have big orange button for shutter, AF that's driving the autofocus a lot like the AFD button on the rear of the X1D2, and then finally the battery status indicator. So what's really neat about this is that the interface is incredibly familiar, and so I'm not having to relearn a new menu or kind of relearn where everything's located, and I can very easily adjust the settings. Now, what's really neat is that as I make changes on the camera, so I'm just moving the rear control dial, the exposure changes are updated nearly instantly. And likewise, if you have them further apart from each other, changes that you make in the app are also reflected on the rear of the camera screen almost instantly as well. So in this case, what I'll do is just fire off an image. Really not sure where the exposure is, so bear with me. Nor the focus. Wow. So what we'll do here is actually open up that camera control pane, tap the AF menu, and that's just driving the autofocus. And one thing that we are missing at the moment is live view, and I can assure you that is something that we are working on. So the ability to remotely address the image is something that we do want to bring forward in a future update. But in this case, I can just keep an eye on the control screen of the camera and of course fire an image. What's neat is that with the wired connectivity with USB 3 transfer speeds, the level or the latency in the communication is quite low, meaning that when I make a change or when I fire the camera from the iPad, it's nearly instant to the camera and then transferring an image back. So if, for example, I back out of the large view and fire off quite a regular series of shots, you can actually see that in that continuous drive burst mode, it's very quick to actually bring those images in. So in this case, my exposure is not far off. Maybe perhaps I shouldn't be at ISO 3200, so I'll just bring that down 2 stops and adjust my shutter speed accordingly and make sure that we're still there. Now, because I've chosen on this device in terms of my direct file storage, those images are being imported directly into Phocus Mobile 2, meaning that I don't have to import them after the fact. Now, if I wanted to work with images that were already on the SD card, for example, all I would need to do is tab over to camera. And on here, you can actually see some images that are on the camera's SD card already. And to import those, all you need to do is either pull one up, or you can actually see some metadata information, or you can back out to the grid view and press select. And from there, you can actually click on multiples just by tapping them, or you can also just drag your finger to select multiples or deselect them. So in this case, I'll just pick up 3 examples there, and then click the download icon at the top left-hand corner here, and select Save to Local Album. So what's neat is that I have the status indicator here, and because I have that really fast USB 3 transfer speed, downloading the images is lightning fast. So huge fan of that transfer speed. And from that point, those images have been copied from the SD card into the iPad's internal storage, and they now appear on my inside my Phocus Mobile 2 grid. So what's neat about how we store the files is that we do give you a fair bit of flexibility in backups or redundancies in terms of managing the image. So for example, I'll exit Phocus Mobile 2 and go over to the iPadOS Files app. And if I tab over to on my iPad, you can see that there's a Phocus Mobile 2 folder. I can go into the images folder, and the images that I imported can easily be dragged and dropped to another storage solution. So in this case, on the left, I have a couple of options like iCloud Drive and Dropbox. likewise, because the latest release of iPadOS supports external storage devices, I could plug in a flash drive or an SSD and drag that that image over to these storage locations as well. So a really neat and simple way of making sure that you also have the option to back up your files as you import. So I'll go and open up an image here, and we'll run you through some of the rating options. So we use a star rating as well as the color flags that's very familiar throughout the Hasselblad software interface. One major note is that it is the internet, so everything gets compressed down to a particularly crunchy bit rate. So things are looking a little bit more contrasty than they are here. If you have the ability to download Phocus Mobile 2 on your own, you can actually download sample images in the original 3FR RAW to try and experiment with on your own as well. So in this case, using the green, yellow, red as my primary kind of culling tools, I'll mark red files that I'm not a fan of and we'll go and delete them. That's kind of somewhere in the middle. This one's a little bit overexposed, but I think we can save it. And then that's from our tethered setup there. So what's neat is that once I've gone through and rated a few images from the import, I can also go over to my view option there. And this is where I start sorting and filtering. So I have the option to sort by ascending or descending. I can filter out whether I'm showing 3FRs, the raw files, or JPEGs if I imported JPEGs, stars, colors, and then also the option for overlays. So if I want to see EXIF data overlaid in the grid or rating information overlaid in the grid, by default, you're just seeing the thumbnails there. So in this case, I actually only want to see images that I've marked as green. Let's go ahead and add one more this here. Just tab over to the info screen, and then maybe one from our tethered setup. Not too bad there. We'll add that one as well. So once we have those selected, and let's say we only want to edit and optimize our top picks, I'll select that green filter, and now those three images are being shown in kind of that filtered view. Now, conveniently, if at any point you select a filter that doesn't have any images that meet that criteria, it does warn you, so you're not in the empty abyss of not knowing whether or not things are showing up. So we'll click reset and go over to green. And let's start with this image here. So fair bit overexposed, and in this case, it's a 6-minute long exposure, shot it with a Polar Pro ND1000. So I was able to get that kind of glassy look on the water and really smooth things out in this, aesthetically pleasing way. But I do want to bring the exposure back down. And one of the strengths of using Phocus Mobile 2 with the Hasselblad files is that you're working with the full resolution and dynamic range of what the camera is capable of. So even as I dial in a 2-stop exposure drop, I'm still able to retain data that was previously just blown out, even past the average 14-stop dynamic range of the X1T2. But I can go through using the sliders. Very familiar user interface in terms of any other raw editor. So we have exposure, contrast, brightness, highlight recovery, and we can even bring in the shadow fill a little bit. And then for the clarity slider, of course, you can double tap to zoom in or pinch to zoom using the using 2 fingers and finagle the clarity there. Now down below that, you have the curves tool, which is presented either as a composite RGB, or you can separate out the channels for red, green, and blue. So if you're going for a pseudo, let's say, cross-process light look, I'm personally not a fan, but mileage may vary, you could use the separate color curves there. Now, if at any point in time you want to step it back, you have 2 tools that help you with that. The first is a 1-step undo, so let's undo that there. And likewise, you can go full reset on the image down here with the circular undo button here, which brings the image back to original import status. So in this case, we'll just do a little contrast, bring down the brightness, bring back the shadows a little bit. And again, GoToWebinar compresses the image down, so you're seeing significantly more contrast on the live broadcast than you are on the actual. So next tool set down, we'll go over to color correction. And up top, we have 2 global controls, saturation and vibrancy. Saturation addressing the entire image as the same color channels, vibrancy, which concentrates on unsaturated colors as priority. So just 2 little finesses there. And skipping down to the bottom, we also have white balance, which is the cool to warm color shift, as well as the green to magenta color shift. Again, one feature that we are working on and are aware of as a feature request is to add a white balance picker, and it is something that our software team is addressing in a future update. At the very bottom, the grayscale conversion, where you can do a very traditional monochrome conversion, so just using the RGB or red, green, blue adjustments. In this case, if I wanted to maybe accentuate the sky, not that much, and then bring out some of the tonal data in the yellow-orange channel, we'd just finesse things there. And then very easily, you can also disable it there to bring it back to a color image. Now in the middle here, don't worry, we didn't skip over it, is actually one of my favorite tools, the selective color picker. So you can actually pick up to 6 different values in a single image and then selectively adjust their hue, saturation, and lightness. So if I go over to a shot like this, what I can do here is actually just pick up the tool, which is indicated by the double circle and crosshairs, and drag that around. And so as I'm navigating through the image, it's highlighting red areas that are being picked up with that selective color tool. And I can then use the range slider to make that more or less selective. And the general working recommendation here is to bring the range as low as you can while still addressing the areas of the image that you want to adjust. So if I bring it all the way to the bottom, not really an optimal selection, but I'll bring it up until the sky is being selected, but not over the top to where it's contaminating in parts of the building. So it's not a bad choice there. And then from here, I can just do some simple HSL adjustments for hue, saturation, and lightness if I wanted to just accentuate the sky a little bit there. So moving on down to our next tool set, we have lens corrections, which are enabled by default. So this was shot on the XCD80. There's not a ton of distortion, chromatic aberration, or vignetting to be had. So you can toggle those profiles off if you choose to, but very easily we'll just keep them on. And likewise, vignetting 100% with the full profile being applied, 0 at minimum, and then going the opposite direction to darken the corners a little bit, just a very basic vignette adjustment. The noise filter, let's actually scroll over to an image that was shot at a higher ISO. And you can see here that I have the ability to adjust both color and luminance noise or color and brightness noise. So if I zoom into a area of detail here, firstly, I'm realizing that I do have to clean my own camera. So that is something that I promise I will work on afterwards, along with luminance noise here. So because we shot this at ISO 3200, there is a bit of color noise in there, but we can very easily tune that out. Admittedly, looking at the webinar preview, it is very contrasty in the broadcast, so do apologize if you're seeing it as crushed blacks. We do have the detail in the leatherette there still. And then sharpness down here, a very traditional sharpness setup where you can go in and dial in the sharpness amount, radius, and threshold. Now, we bring the images in with no sharpness because it is kind of one of those very objective or subjective choices where it's up to the viewer to apply the amount of sharpness, and you don't ever want to make a decision for the user. So in this case, we can just go in and dial in a little bit of sharpness and then increase the threshold and even things out there. And a really neat tool is the dark limit slider. So this is in place to basically avoid over sharpening in areas of dark values to bring in more noise. So basically like an image with this where I have a lot of dark information in the lower tonal parts, and it's at relatively high ISO. If I were to apply global sharpening as a single pass, it would start introducing noise because I'm sharpening basically noisy data. But what I can do is adjust the dark limit so that it's applying less sharpening to darker areas of the image overall, so that I have a more optimal result without making it look too noisy. So scrolling back to our other example image, we'll move on down to the crop tool. And from here, I have the angle adjustments on the right, very easy to adjust there. And then down below that, I can of course input a locked in aspect ratio. So by default, it's free form, meaning that I can pick up any of the corners and drag them to any aspect ratio. But if I set it to a specific ratio, like 1:1 for square, and then use the 2-finger pinch to navigate around the image, it's very easy to recompose and crop the image there. So let's say this is a crop that I'm going for. We'll just set it by tapping the crop symbol there, and then come back full circle to the info icon where we started out by rating the images. You can also see metadata information like the camera, the original resolution or file dimensions, along with the lens and exposure information. So with these edits in play, our next kind of natural step is to go ahead and export or share it. And there are kind of three primary options here. The first is JPEG full size, and this is the full resolution with the adjusted image. So it does reflect the adjustments that we've made for exposure, color, and crop. So the resolution reflects that crop. And then below that, you have JPEG medium size, and that is a 75% reduction, or 1/4 of the original resolution. So if I have a 50 megapixel image, I'm looking at about 12 to 13 megapixels with that resolution in play. So the full size is quite nice if you want to send someone a large full resolution preview of things, and the medium size is that if you just want to send a really quick preview at a compact file size, it's quite nice. Both are in the sRGB color format, so they are kind of optimized or shared ready for the web, but the full size option is at 300 dpi, and the medium size is at 72 dpi. Now, the 3FR raw option is really meant for if you're looking to edit the unedited or unadjusted raw file or back it up as was imported from camera. So when you choose the 3FR option, that is being done without any adjustments applied. So it is an original camera raw. And one of the key examples that we have in play for this would be if you do your editing in another program. Say, for example, if you're a Lightroom CC user, you do, of course, have the option to edit in Lightroom CC. So for here, I'll just tap the 3FR option, and you can see that I have the Lightroom applet. And then also any other share options that you have in your iPad OS, you can also do easily adjust the share. So if I wanted to airdrop the raw file to my phone or a friend that's close by, I can of course do that. But let's go and show you that Lightroom option because it is easy as anything else. Just by tapping it, it says the next time I launch Lightroom, it's going to automatically bring that file in. We'll launch Lightroom now, and automatically brings that file in. So as mentioned, it is without adjustment. So it's straight out of Camera Raw. So any of the exposure adjustments that I did in Phocus Mobile 2 do not go alongside it. So the ability to export adjustments with the original RAW definitely is a feature that we are aware of, and I'm hoping that we can bring it in a future update. But for now, the 3FR export is really meant for the unedited version. In consideration of where Phocus Mobile 2 really can transform your workflow, it's really neat in many aspects of the connectivity process, meaning that you can connect over Wi-Fi or USB connection with your choice, depending on whatever the particular shoot or your preferences prefer. And likewise, the ability to stay up to date with the latest firmware is incredibly easy with firmware updates available through the app, downloading over the air, or you still have the option to install manually via an SD card if you choose to. Configuring your settings in order to remotely control the camera, so the ability to adjust exposure and fire the camera as well as driving autofocus is now made incredibly easy with a very, very familiar user interface, along with the ability to handle the full resolution original 3FR RAW file, along with JPEG support if you're shooting JPEGs in camera. So given the power of these, you can either import directly to or shoot directly to the iPad's internal storage or import from the SD card after the fact. A great example of this would be if you're one day shooting on location and want a tethered connection, and the next day you're working solo and you want to import the images after the fact. You have a ton of flexibility here. And once those files are imported into Phocus Mobile 2, you can of course organize and filter them using the tricolor rating tools along the star flag, and really hone down the images as you see fit, along with an adjustment tool. And with the adjustment capabilities that really take advantage of the full file fidelity that the Hasselblad X system of cameras can produce, you really have a ton of power in terms of getting to a final image that's really optimized in terms of something that you want to share. And so with the ability to share the reduced resolution JPEG, a full resolution JPEG, or the original unedited RAW for further editing to another program, you have a ton of flexibility in how you navigate through this, and really the idea of portable image making. And holistically, Phocus Mobile 2 is really in that line of the idea of really stunning medium format image quality and a more portable form factor. And so when we set out to develop the program, it was the idea of, okay, we've transformed portability in photography, but how can we also carry this over to the post-processing and image sharing aspect? So that about wraps up our presentation. There's of course a ton more that you can learn about Phocus Mobile 2, and that Learning More PDF in the handout section is a great place to look into a couple more resources. As mentioned, the Exploring Focus webinar, along with the Focus 3.5 desktop demo. I really encourage you, as you're able, to take a look at those, along with links to our events page where you can join us for some upcoming events. Later in the month, we actually have a couple of really great and exciting artist talks planned for you. So hope that you're able to join us for those. But for now, let's actually, if I can, invite my colleague Chris Coos on to go over a couple of questions that we've had come into the audience. Oh, there he is. The man,
Can
the
you hear me?
legend, Chris Coos. We can hear you. How are you, Chris?
Yeah, very well, thank you.
Very
That went
good, very
really
good.
quick.
Glad. Thanks. The good news is that we do have a recording that you can view after the fact. So following this webinar session, we will send you a recording afterwards so you can view it afterwards. But we're glad to have everyone here live with us today. So we've had a fair number of questions come in, and really thankful to have this interaction with you. If you don't mind, we'll just go through a couple and then kind of split them and see how we can best address them. So first question we've got here is, will Focus Mobile be offered for the Android platform? That's a tricky one.
Unfortunately, we're basically concentrating on the iOS platform at the moment. In terms of obviously iPad, future, we hope to add the iPhone support. And I think the problem with the Android platform is there's so many different flavors that getting it to be able to function as we want it to is a little bit more difficult. So we tend to concentrate on the iOS platform.
Gotcha, gotcha. Great question about our cable options there. Will any USB Type-C to Type-C cable work, or what are the specific recommendations that we have?
Yeah, again, I think there's many options out there. You can buy cheap USB cables, which tend to be sort of data only, but you've got to get a full data and charging cable, which tend to be a little bit more expensive, but they're generally a little bit better quality, better built, and generally they're classed as full USB Type C 3.1 style cables. Basically to replace what you get in the box with the camera, so a high quality cable.
Yeah, very much in that vein of you do get what you pay for, so always recommend a higher spec cable. Ricardo has a great question about focusing the camera with the iPad. We briefly looked at it, but right now there's the ability to just tap the AF button in the camera control pane, and that starts the autofocus based on whatever point that you've selected. But as we introduce more features to the app itself, we will be kind of finagling this. As an alternative, if you're shooting with the desktop app, there's actually a couple of great focus tools. I know this is a little bit of a sidetrack, but Chris, what are options for focusing remotely on the desktop app?
Yeah, well, the desktop, because you've got that full live view function, you can then literally use the pointer to select any point in the image, and you'll get a magnified view. And for somebody that's maybe doing product photography and wants full control, by clicking on the specific area, you can actually get a magnified view and a sort of an output graph which tells you how sharp that image is, and you can use the fine adjustments within Focus Desktop to get critical focus. Unfortunately, as you say, it's going to be a little while before we add some more features to the iPad app, but it will come.
Definitely. And to learn more about that, definitely check out that Focus 3.5 webinar that's linked in the PDF handout. It goes into great depth. I mean, not bragging, but having used Focus for a couple of years now, even that, learned some new tips and tricks that I just forgot. So really thankful to have that. We do have a question about iPhone compatibility for Focus Mobile. And as I understand that, it's in the works.
Yep, it's in the works. Again, we wanted to get the iPad version stable, add some new features, and then port across what we could to the iPhone. So again, we will be adding that. Obviously, with a more limited feature set, you're not going to be able to do everything on the phone that you can do on the iPad, but we will be bringing out an iPad phone version shortly.
Very cool. Have a couple of questions coming in about that 3FR export option. So it looks like, just to confirm, when I export a 3FR file, that's that's without adjustments. And that's kind of in line with how we treat 3FR and FFF, right?
Yep, yep. I mean, the whole point is that when you have a camera captured raw file, when we import that into, say, the desktop version, we then apply additional corrections. So things like lens corrections, behind the scene tweaks, if you like, which then fully turn that file into a raw with all the information about Hasselblad and its color and the camera and lenses. And so we don't want to sort of lose that functionality when the files are brought through from the iPad. We want to be able to then have a, if you like, the clean raw file to then import to maybe the desktop version, or there are other systems out there to actually process the file, and then apply those corrections, and you have a fully processed, should we say, Hasselblad raw.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it keeps the terminology clear, but we are looking on always expanding what the export capabilities are, and we do definitely hear that feature request. I have a great question. When we glossed over Lightroom, there was a question about how it syncs and backs up. So while we aren't Adobe and today isn't a Lightroom demo, but if you're looking for that, definitely suggestion in the question box. Happy to hear what you're looking to get out of the webinar. But basically, with Lightroom CC, as soon as I open it into the program or the app, it starts the cloud backup. So if I have a CC subscription with whatever capacity is provided at that membership level, it also starts backing up a file. And this is where you typically want to have a faster Wi-Fi connection if you can. One recommendation or small little discovery is when I was not in the home office, I would just use an Ethernet plug to connect to the iPad because it's USB Type-C and it's amazing. And really that recommendation of the 3rd and 4th gen iPad Pro is really fantastic. And the same goes for any other cloud backup solution. It's going over the air unless you can do a wired connection as well. Scrolling through a couple of other questions here. Is there an option for TIFF export, or if not, how would I export a TIFF?
Yeah, currently within the iPad app, obviously we don't have that. It is on the list to be added because it's been requested by so many people as an output. But
Yep.
obviously, if you need to do TIFF output or even 16-bit at this point, the best way is to export the files once you get back to base to a desktop version. Then you've got the full raft in terms of TIFF, TIFF 16, PSD, many more options, as well as obviously the full color management suite there to export to your exact requirements.
Definitely, very cool. In terms of the connectivity interface, it looks like, do I have the ability to use an SD card reader and connect into Phocus Mobile too?
But effectively, the camera acts as an SD card reader anyway, doesn't it? So from that point of view, you could just use the camera to do that, and
Yeah.
then as you demonstrated within the presentation, you can then import the files directly to the iPad from the camera if you so wish.
Yeah, and that's really, I would say, the recommended workflow. You can connect an SD card reader and use the Photos app, but there's not a way of porting images into the app remotely at the moment. So if you want to view the images in Focus Mobile to connect them through the camera, and we are investigating other functionalities as people suggest them. So as always, if you have workflow suggestions or feature requests, any of the contact methods, we channel them to the right software and product development teams along the way. And likewise, in today's follow-up email, if you have any wish list items that you want for the Focus platform, or really anything at all, we can't make all the dreams come true, but we do want to hear from you and what will really
Yeah.
optimize our hardware and software products to make things significantly better. Have a feature request for live view on the iPad, and as I understand it, we are working on it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very close on that one. Yeah.
Very close. Hopefully, looking forward to it. And then confirmation of, okay, so I'm having trouble connecting my camera to Focus Mobile 2, and let's again confirm what cameras do work with Focus Mobile 2.
Yeah, I think this is it. Focus Mobile 2 is only compatible with X1D Mark II and the 907X CFV2. That's the only cameras currently that are compatible with Focus Mobile 2. X1D Mark I, H6D and before obviously are compatible with the Wi-Fi functionality of Focus Mobile 1. not to.
Yeah. So always some careful looks at what app you're downloading, one to avoid any confusion and
Yeah,
frustration there. And then the common denominator of all things, our Focus desktop software supports all currently produced cameras,
yeah,
even as far as going back to H1D. So our attitude for backward support still comes into play, but where hardware developments happen and where there are limitations, of course, we have to cope with reality where we can. So we do have a fair number of questions, but our time is unfortunately coming to a close. So I do want to thank you for joining us today and really appreciate you spending the time to learn about Phocus Mobile 2. We do hope that for folks who haven't tried it yet, but do own an X1D2, this has really transformed how you want to look at mobile editing. And if you don't own an X1D2 yet, do stay tuned in the follow-up emails. We do want to hear from you. And if you want to connect with a representative one-on-one, either for a conversation or a one-on-one demo, um, by all means, we'll be reaching out to you and you're welcome to respond to us, and we'll look forward to the conversation. So until then, do check out the events section of our Hasselblad website where you have information about our upcoming events. As I understand it, some really, really exciting artist talks are in store, and we hope to see you there. But until that point, we'll see you next time. Thank you so much, everyone.
thank you.
Thanks, Chris.